Welcome back, everybody. My first guest tonight is the president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Please welcome Sherrilyn Ifill. Ms. Ifill, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
Now, for those who may not know, please explain, what does the NAACP Legal Defense Fund do?
Well, we're a civil rights legal organization. We were founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall, the greatest civil rights lawyer ever, and certainly of the 20th century. And we used to be part of the NAACP, and we split off and we became entirely separate in 1957. We litigated the famous Brown versus Board of Education case that ended legal apartheid in this country, and then continued as civil rights litigators. We were the lawyers for the civil rights movement. We represented Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycotters and Dr. King and the Selma marchers and the Freedom Riders. And we continued on and represented Muhammad Ali and worked in policing and voting and every civil rights area that you can imagine. We're in courts all over the country, and we advocate on Capitol Hill, and we just try to really focus on the way in which the law has to work to bring equality and equal citizenship to everyone.
This moment we're in right now of protest against the police abuse of the black community in the United States, or the over-policing and the violence against the black community, is extraordinary. Over 2,000 cities and towns have had protests, even places where there isn't a large black community. What do you make of this moment, and how can it be sustained and used to make lasting change?
Well, it's a powerful moment. It doesn't spring from nowhere. It is very much connected to the protest that we saw in 2014 when Eric Garner was choked to death by police officers in New York and said, "I can't breathe." And when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, and the following year, Freddie Gray and Walter Scott in South Carolina, the state you're from, and there was a pretty sustained kind of movement around policing reform during those years. And there's a through line to this. But I do think that this moment has brought out something a little bit different and certainly stronger. As you point out, there are protests happening in 50 states. The crowds that you see are multiracial and diverse, and they're not going away. And I think there's something about this George Floyd murder and watching and spending those excruciating 8 minutes together, watching a man beg for his life and watching the casualness of this officer with his hands in his pockets, knowing he's being videotaped, that I think it just shifted something. And that's what happens in civil rights, that these moments happen that capture the imagination, that pull at our hearts, and that galvanize people beyond the kind of core people who are focused on civil rights. And those are the moments in which you have to kind of ride the wave of change. And as you point out, try to sustain it. Try to sustain the outrage. It's exhausting. It's my life every day, but it's exhausting for many people to try to sustain that level of outrage and engagement. It's critical to sustain it until we create some infrastructure for real and lasting change.
What's it like to see the national conversation catch up with the work that you've been doing for decades?
It's disorienting, but it's also wonderful. I look at protests and I see people talking about things that only wonky civil rights lawyers talk about, qualified immunity.
Well, that's my next question.
Oh, okay.
My next question is about qualified immunity.
Yeah.
What is it, and why is it so important to address it? I know the House Democrats bill addresses qualified immunity, and so does the bill that Kamala Harris and Cory Booker introduced. Why is this an important issue?
Well, qualified immunity is the defense that police can offer when they are sued for violations of constitutional rights. And so it's vital that we really look at this doctrine, because one of the pieces that's missing, and what you hear people talking about, is the lack of accountability. And that is that officers are able to kill unarmed, innocent Black people and suffer no consequences. The officer who choked to death Eric Garner in 2014 not only was not indicted, but remained on the NYPD, on the police force, until last August, so for 5 years. So this regime of impunity is part of really what we're protesting about. When people say Black Lives Matter, it really speaks to that. If our lives mattered, then the taking of that life would come with some consequence for these police officers, but it too often doesn't. And it's because of this defense that essentially has worked and been interpreted by courts to essentially immunize police officers from having to be accountable for these killings. And so the doctrine has to be adjusted. It's a judge-made doctrine. It's not in the Constitution. But the way courts have interpreted it, it has become so distorted. So the bill that you're talking about in Congress would change the standard by which we assess this defense of qualified immunity. And when I'm now out and see people at protests carrying signs that say end qualified immunity, for me, it's when I say disorienting, that's what I mean. This is something that lawyers talk about. And by the way, there's bipartisan support to end qualified immunity. Lindsey Graham said, count me in on reforming qualified immunity. I testified in the House, and a number of House Republicans said, yes, we have to look at this. There are conservative judges who want to deal with qualified immunity. The Cato Institute, the kind of conservative libertarian organization, wants to deal with qualified immunity. So we should be able to tackle this, because that issue of accountability is so key to any vision of what reform might look like.
Speaking of reform, some people are calling for defunding the police. I hear demilitarize the police, restructure the police, sometimes abolish the police. What does defunding the police mean in your understanding? And do you think that's the right way to describe how the police can be best be reformed?
Yeah, it's been interesting to see that this phrase, defund the police, makes many people very anxious and very nervous. And then when I explain
right.
It doesn't.
Because if you say defund the fire department, they think that fires are just going to burn.
Yeah, but that's not what it means. What it means is really that we need now, this is our opportunity to do something that's long overdue, which is to fundamentally reimagine what public safety looks like in this country. And what we have done is we have turned over to armed law enforcement officers the right to enter our communities to solve a set of community conflicts that actually don't require an armed officer. Your child that suffers from mental illness is having some kind of crisis and you fear they're going to harm themselves. We call 911 and an armed police officer comes. There's a homeless person that you haven't been able to get services or to move off your stoop. We call 911. Young people are playing outside and it's midnight. You told them to quiet down and they cussed you out. You call 911. All of these are circumstances in which we can point to cases where police show up and someone ends up dead. But what we should have and what we should be investing in are youth counselors, so that you're not dialing 911. Maybe you're dialing 711 when there's a problem that involves a youth conflict resolution need. Maybe you're dialing 511 for a mental health crisis. Maybe you're dialing 411 for a homeless person's crisis. And we're saying those are the services that are also part of the public safety apparatus. And rather than turn the entire public safety regime over to armed law enforcement officers, we need to look at that funding, reduce that funding, and use it to support these other services. And police officers themselves will tell you they don't want to be social workers. They get called upon to solve all kinds of problems that they're not trained to solve. I think we agree. And we should therefore make sure that we can support those who are trained to do those kinds of interactions that also contribute to public safety, that they have the funding that they need. And so I think the anxiety is kind of anxiety about the phrase, but actually not anxiety about the concept. We should be looking at budgets, and we should be looking at how we have tried to solve some of our city's problems and our public safety issues. And we should recognize that this over-reliance on police has given us the regime that we can see that is not working.
Well, Ms. Ifill, thanks so much for being here. Anybody out there who wants to support the Legal Defense Fund can go to NAACPLDF.org. Then go to ColbertLateShow.com/BYOP and get this great Be Your Own President merch, the proceeds of which go to several racial justice organizations, including the Legal Defense Fund. Sherrilyn Ifill, everybody. We'll be right back with comedian Mike Birbiglia.